particularly long sermon to help you all miss as much of the day as possible. So, let's get started. When I titled this sermon, The Whole Shebang, I honestly don't know what made me title it that. It seemed a good idea at the time. And certainly, I didn't come up with anything better before the Beacon deadline. So, as I stand up here saying it, though, it certainly sounds a little foolish considering the rest of the sermon. You know, a good goodbye would have been better, or saying goodbye well, or putting the good in goodbye, or some other clever play on those words. But I realized while I was working on this sermon that I had agreed to write and deliver a sermon on the last few days of my quarter, and the last quarter of my degree. I'm graduating next week. It's been a long, interesting journey. And you know, it's also between clinical pastoral education units at the hospital, which means that there's only a few of us covering the shifts. So that means that, you know, I'm working 24-hour on-calls a couple of times a week. And it just all seemed like a good idea when I said yes to it 5 or 6 weeks ago. I don't know, does anyone else have that experience where you say yes to something, you look out 5 or 6 weeks and everything looks great, and you say yes, and then as you get closer to it, you go, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? Right? But actually the timing of thinking about this works out pretty well for me personally. This is Memorial Day weekend, of course, and the word of the month is wholeness. And it just seemed appropriate to think about how we say goodbye. So I'm saying goodbye to my fellow seminarians, whom I've grown to love and respect. I'm not going to be spending time with them in the same way anymore. Of course, we have our Facebook group, but you know, it's just not the same. And we just finished a unit of clinical pastoral education, and I said goodbye to Julie Vesley, who I've had a lot of time with now, and who's a member of this congregation and trained in chaplaincy as well. And I won't be doing any more pastoral education with her. And we just did our big event in our congregational meeting, right? It's pretty awesome news this year. We exceeded expectations on pledges. It's been a while, I think, since we've done that. So that feels pretty good. But not, well, also we've had amazing things. The solar panels this year, you know, filling the holes in the parking lot. It's been an amazing year for our community. But, you know, not everything has been so joyful. We've had to say goodbye to Mildred this weekend. And we've had our losses as well. There's been other losses in families and among friends in this community this year. So how do we say goodbye well? It seems a suitable question to ask on Memorial Day. Now, I don't know what you all know about Memorial Day. I had to go and look it up. I've always just heard this Memorial Day thing and participated in it. Usually it meant playing in the yard in summer or going to barbecues or picnics. It meant there were different flags up on the flagpoles. But Memorial Day was actually officially created in 1966 by the U.S. government, and its official starting place is a place called Waterloo. Because starting May 5th in 1866, Waterloo started hosting an annual community-wide event where they would close businesses and members of the community would decorate the graves of Civil War soldiers with flags and flowers. And it was General John A. Logan, and he was the first to call for a nationwide day of remembrance in honor of those who lost their lives in the Civil War. And it was called originally Decoration Day because that's what you did. You went out and decorated the grave sites. And it was set up on the 30th of May because that wasn't the anniversary of any particular battle. So, and it was to commemorate the 600,000 lives lost in the Civil War. I don't know if you can contemplate that number, but World War I, I'm given, was, to understand, was 100 and something thousand American soldiers lost. So the Civil War would have left holes in nearly every community across the country. So it was later on that Decoration Day became Memorial Day and became the day that we remember all of those who would have lost their lives or given their lives in military service to this country. And, you know, we may have mixed feelings about that because we may not agree with the cause or the military war or whatever, but still, it's important for us to honor and remember those who made that sacrifice, the people who made that sacrifice. So it's most certainly a season and a weekend of saying goodbye. So how do we say goodbye well? I asked you to think about that during the meditation today. And I know I went kind of quickly through the meditation, but I wanted you to have a moment to think about what came to mind first. You know, those things that are kind of buried in us, our assumptions. The first time I had that question asked was actually in a clinical pastoral education group, a CPE group. It was the end of my first group. And my supervisor, Nancy, asked the question, what do you guys know about saying goodbye? You know, and it was this rich, incredible conversation. And it makes a lot of sense to ask that question of pastors and chaplains, given that we spend a lot of time helping people say goodbye. It was really interesting. Everyone answered differently. I remember a colleague in that group who said they do not say goodbye, ever. You know, and as I looked out across the audience as you were thinking about it, I saw some of you squirming a little bit in your chairs, or either the muscles of your face growing longer, or discomfort coming up as you thought about saying goodbye. It's not something we do very easily. It is something very important. There were a couple of us in the group from the East Coast who remembered leaving gatherings with our families, and the moment we got in the car, the thing to do was to shred everybody and everything that was there as harshly as you could. So the two of us that remembered that, and it might be an East Coast thing, I don't know, because we were both from the East Coast, but the two of us that remembered that agreed that it was best to sneak out the back and not say goodbye to anyone in the hopes that nobody would shred you after you left. Before that conversation, I had never really reflected on goodbyes before. Certainly not with a group of people so good at reflecting as a bunch of pastors and chaplains. So when I went to seminary for my last gathering days, which was just at the end of April, I was sitting around at dinner with some fellow seminarians, some folks that I've grown to love quite a bit. And I asked that same question over the Mediterranean dinner that we were having at Jerusalem Cafe, which, by the way, is right off of Denver University campus. It's really good. So if you're ever down there. But I asked that same question, and the conversation was, again, rich and meaningful. You might think that seminarians are all deep, right? That all we do is sit around having deep thoughts and rich philosophical conversations. And we do that sometimes, it's true. We argue theology and philosophy, and we cite books that nobody has ever heard about. But most of the time we gripe about classes and tell jokes, like any other group of university students. Sometimes we go to karaoke and we try to sing deep songs. I remember Queen's Who Wants to Live Forever being one of the songs at karaoke at midnight on a Thursday night when we all had class at 8 a.m. the next morning. So, not exactly what you would expect from a bunch of pastors. But when I asked them over dinner what it was like to say goodbye, we did have a deep conversation, vulnerable. And again, some of them were uncomfortable with saying goodbye. Some of them said no goodbyes. In fact, I think most of us sitting around the table had to admit that. But there was one person at the table whose answer really touched me. He's a friend of mine. He actually is from Salt Lake City and started this program at the same time I did, but from a different denomination. And his answer was he had been in drama earlier in life, so he'd been in plays. I don't know, how many of you have done some sort of theater type thing or some sort of play performance? You get to know people really well in a short amount of time, or at least you feel like you do. Because there's a lot of intimacy to being that emotionally expressive and sharing that much with people. And then at the end of it, there's a cast party and everybody's gone, usually. So he got cards for everyone who was in the theater performances with him. And in each card, he wrote something that he really liked about them. And then he gave them that card. I was really touched. It was a very touching way of remembering what was important to him and what was ending, and giving that person something to remember it by. Remembering what's important helps us to connect with one another, even when we know we have to say goodbye. And we do have to say goodbye. Because we become memories, things become memories, memorials to time past. That is what happens. Everything, everyone eventually leaves. It's an uncomfortable reality, but it is part of what we do. After all, we're not eternal. Although I think maybe some church governance meetings may be eternal. They go on forever at least. So, but we, even if we have to sit in those meetings, we're finite. We have a limited time. Now there's some authors I like a lot named Kenneth Mitchell and Herbert Anderson, and they wrote an exceptional book on grief called All Our Losses, All Our Griefs. It's been around for decades. I read it, I enjoyed it so much, I was really surprised when I opened it up and the publication date was 1983. They say that the source of our loss is our finitude, our finite nature. We feel lost because we are finite. We might say the universe is infinite, but when I think about creation, our experience of it is certainly finite. We have abstract models maybe that are infinite, we can model in something infinite with mathematics, but we have no way of really experiencing it. So, Mitchell and Anderson go a step further, and they make the potentially disturbing assertion that being finite is part of what makes creation good. Because there's always room for something more. And our act of loss makes room for something next. Our saying goodbye is part of making space. It's our struggle with that finitude that's the source of our sense of loss in our lives. And regarding finitude as beneficial to all of creation, that doesn't make a specific loss any easier, nor is it meant to. What they say is that our losses are hard because we grow attached. And this is a concept from Buddhism as well. But we grow attached, according to Mitchell and Anderson, because we love. Because we're creatures who are meant to love and made to love. We fall in love. We fall in love with people, ideas, things, places, communities. And our goodbyes set the boundaries around those things. So they make the reality of our finitude very, very solid and real to us. Because we love, those endings hurt. This season's been a season of goodbyes at the hospital as well, in an unusual way. We had an unusual number of young men coming into the hospital and dying this May. The majority of them were some sort of injury or overdose or something like that, and then we would be with them for 24 hours or so, and then as the tests came back, we'd find that there was just too much anoxic brain injury for a person to be able to return from that. I spent Mother's Day with a family that had just heard that there was too much anoxic brain injury in their son. And I spent that day with them as they were trying to decide to withdraw care from their 20-something son. It was very real, very powerful, and very overwhelming. medicine, as highly developed as it is also finite. There's only so much that it can do. And unless they wanted him to live on machines with no hope of consciousness, they had to say goodbye. And they knew that he would never want that. So while we were together, we talked about his life, we talked about the challenges, we talked about losses, limits, its joys too. Then the conversation helped the family to make some sense of that loss. And I don't mean sense in terms of rational or logical, making it okay. Because there's absolutely nothing that makes that circumstance okay. I mean sense in terms of touching it, feeling it, and exploring how it feels. Building a relationship to the loss and to the change. And exploring that relationship. And when he died a few nights later, after withdrawing care, after spending time together, the family asked me if I would do the memorial service. And I was really touched. It was the middle of the night, close to 1 in the morning. And of course I said yes. I said, yes, of course I will make time, you know. Then the next morning, I looked at my schedule and what I have due for school and and the work I had to do and the shifts I had to cover. And I had the horrifying realization that I could not make time without failing some of my final assignments from graduate school. And I just can't do that. So I was disturbed and in agony. And for those of you that know the way schools work, they do have bereavement, but I can't call my school up and say, by the way, would it be okay if you all stayed after the school year ends to enter my grades because I committed to this thing and I really need you guys to just shift your whole schedule and summer plans. So I was so disturbed that I called a mentor of mine and I talked with her about it for a little while. And I was really overwhelmed, I was attached, and I really wanted to help and support them because their pain had been so real to me. And I knew that they didn't have other pastoral relationships. I knew they weren't part of a community here in the valley, and I knew that they didn't know where else they would go. So when I called my mentor and spoke to her, she agreed that I really did not have time to help them say goodbye well. That if I agreed to it, I would be rushed. And I would do them and the young man a disservice. So saying goodbye well is really important. My mentor also said something to me that I thought was really interesting and that was comforting to me. And it's been stinking with me for the last week and a half or so. You don't have time, that's the right call. And it feels awful. She said it feels awful to turn away someone who's in need, but I think for you, with your responsibilities, it's the right thing to do, and it feels awful. I was supposed to feel awful, having to say no to that. There was something in that just, there was I remember the moment when she said that, I actually felt the tension just leave me. I just said yes to feeling inadequate. But I'm finite. I have a finite amount of time, attention, and capacity. There's a limit to how much I can handle. So it was supposed to feel awful for me to leave them. And I didn't have any other choice, unless I was willing to sacrifice things that I can't. So I felt awful because I wanted to support them. I wanted to nurture them. I wanted to care for them. I wanted to be that person. So I called as quickly as I could, and this feels even worse. I left a voicemail, right? Can you imagine? But they didn't answer the phone. And the kindest thing that I could do to them was be as clear as possible, as quickly as possible. So I left a voicemail. And an interesting thing happened. Because I said no, because I said farewell, because I said goodbye and admitted my limits, they had to find another pastor. And the person they found was a much better fit for their background and tradition. The person they found had a much deeper understanding of their spiritual heritage and was every bit as sensitive and understanding as I would have been, probably more. That person also had a lot more experience leading memorial services than I did. I think that's what Mitchell and Anderson meant when they say, our finitude leaves space for the goodness of creation. The person who wound up serving them in their time of loss was far more prepared than I was. So it's very painful. There's nothing easy or okay about what I'm talking about when we're in the midst of a specific loss. And I think all those phrases and platitudes that are designed to try and make us feel better when we're hurting from that loss are just not very helpful to us. You know, I've heard people say, God just wanted another angel. You know, or God must have needed them more than we did. Really? God, the Almighty, the Alpha and the Omega, needed them more than I did? Really? It's just not helpful to our sense of loss, right? Saying that ends our conversation. It ends the memory. It minimizes what we feel in that moment of saying goodbye. And minimizing is not what we need. We do not need to minimize the emptiness, the sorrow, the anger, the loss, the sadness. When we have to say goodbye to something that we love, minimizing is not what nurtures and engages the depth of our being. I don't think it's what helps us find our way to healing. What helps us to say goodbye well is to remember that which we love. That which has been important to us, and to honor it, to touch it, to feel it, and to sense it. Like my pastor friend who wrote something special for each person in his drama troupe. At the end of his time with them, and he gave it to them. So it aches to say goodbye that way. Honestly, listening to him, even that simple little story made a little ache in my chest. But we're supposed to ache at that time. It's how we're made. This quarter, I took a course on death and dying in pastoral care from a really well-known provider of pastoral care, Dr. Larry Graham. And one of the things that we had to do was we had to take a virtual tour of the Oklahoma City Memorial. Just out of curiosity, is anyone here familiar with that memorial? Anyone know its layout or anything like that? Okay. The virtual tour was hosted by another ILS seminarian who had graduated, and who was also a first responder on the site. I was just moved to tears through most of the tour. I've never seen anything more touching or more graceful, really, at least not as far as memorial spaces. The space is designed with multiple spaces laid out over a place. It has a survivor tree, a rescuer's grove next to that. There's a reflecting pool with gates on either side of the reflecting pool. And then across from the survivor's tree, looking at it, is a field of empty chairs, one for each person who lost their life during that disaster. There's 168 different empty chairs, and 19 of them are child-sized, to reflect the loss of the children who were in that building in the daycare when it was bombed. At either side of the reflecting pool, there's two gateways. The eastern gate shows 901 when the bomb struck, and the western gate shows 903 when they said the city was changed forever. Each of the gates sets the finitude of the space, the boundaries of it. Well, what strikes me about the Oklahoma City Outdoor Memorial is that it gives space for wandering. I mean, in memory, in grief, and goodbyes, we need space to wander. And the memorial gives that space. Sometimes we need to sit with the emptiness we feel from that field of empty chairs. And other times there's a sense of reflection, a feeling of memory, of reflecting, of recalling, and we need that reflecting pool. And other times we have to touch the memories of beauty and a feeling of hope. And the Survivor's Tree in the Rescuer's Grove holds that. And it's just an open space, and people can move from those different areas and different centers as they feel the need. What struck me about the Oklahoma City Memorial, outdoor memorial, was how incredible a metaphor it was, and is, for saying goodbye and remembering well. The way the space wanders, offering us different ways to connect to the memory, different ways of bridging to the past. It opens a range of feelings. It doesn't try to minimize or control. One of the ways in which we find healing when we have to say goodbye is to allow our relationship with what is gone to shift and change into something else. Something that honors what was there before. Not the same as it was, because that's gone. But something new. A good goodbye is about sensing, not making sense and explaining or rationalizing. And it's about sensing and touching, feeling. It's not about the explaining and rationalizing that some sayings or platitudes are designed to do, to explain. We need to sense that losses and to touch it and to hold it and to move through it in different ways. That's how we say goodbye well. There's a phrase in Celtic spirituality that comes to mind that has been also really haunting me lately. It's called Anam Cara. Anam Cara means soul friendship. Anam is soul, Cara means friend. And Anam Cara is to engage in that open space with one another. Flowing willingly between the empty chairs, the growing tree, the reflecting pool. It's leaving space for all that we feel. And walking alongside with each other in that space so that we're not alone. That's saying goodbye well. Saying goodbye with a sense of wholeness. Allowing the whole of the space, the whole of the memories, the whole of who we were. So I ask you again, what do you know about saying goodbye? What did your family teach you? Your past? Your job? And how do you want to be able to say goodbye well? Thank you. If you'll now join us for our closing hymn. Number 354, We Laugh, We Cry.